Welcome to the panel on architecture and adornment in this beautiful theater on the USD campus. Our panelists for today are Marilynn Johnson and Daniel López-Pérez, and it's going to be moderated by Noelle Norton.
Hello.
Take it away.
Hi. Can you hear me? Everybody? Good. Before we get started on anything, I really want to thank the San Diego Union-Tribune, the Festival of Books Committee, Dr. Brian Clack, our Humanities Center Director, University Advancement staff here at USD, the Tanya Albin from the College of Arts and Sciences, and our Mary Dupree from the College of Arts and Sciences for their work in making this festival brilliant and fun. We have several panels of USD faculty authors today. They will all be held in here. This is the first one that we've done live with the Festival of Books. We've done these USD faculty panels virtually for the past 2 years as the presenting sponsor, but this is the first time we get to do it live. These panels that we do were the Brian Clack, the Humanities Center Director, knows that we do author panels at our Humanities Center. We also partner with Warwick's Books, as many of you may know, but we haven't really showcased externally what we do here and what our authors do, and you're going to be privileged to see exactly the great scholarship and the great work that's being done by our faculty. So again, you heard their names, but I am just delighted to introduce Dr. Marilynn Johnson. She is from our philosophy department. Here is her book. It is called Adorning Bodies, Meaning, Evolution, and Beauty in Humans and Animals. And it is published by Bloomsbury Press. And everybody's got a copy up here. It's a lovely book. And then I also want to introduce Dr. Daniel López-Pérez from our Art, Architecture, and Art History department. Yes, it is one department. We call it AA plus AH. And he's here to talk about his book, R. Buckminster Fuller, Pattern Thinking, and it's published by Lars Mueller Publishers. So this is just an exciting panel, Adornment and Architecture, because both books address questions of beauty, adornment, and efficiency, if you can believe it, and pattern thinking. So I'm going to just stop talking, though, and turn the panel over to our authors. My first question is going to just be to have each of them introduce the basic concept of their book. And we'll just start with Daniel, then we'll move over to Marilynn. So in case you haven't read it yet, you know exactly what they're doing. So as I ask some more questions, you'll have that groundwork. We'll talk with them for about 30 minutes. And then we'll move on to any audience questions that may be of interest to you. So, Dr. López-Pérez.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And I join Noelle in thanking everybody, all the organizers for this event. And anytime we have a chance to spread the word of scholarship in our books, we're very, very grateful. My book is a kind of a chronology of R. Buckminster Fuller's work. Buckminster Fuller is a kind of a 20th century polymath. He was this extraordinary figure, most well known for his invention of the geodesic dome. If anybody has been to Montreal, you've seen his largest work on the Expo dome. But he did a lot more than that. He was a prolific writer, a prolific author, a prolific engineer, architect, poet, and he also was a prolific teacher. So he taught all across the US, transforming many, many, many design, architecture, engineering programs. So my book focuses on those years, 1948 to 1968, which is his most prolific period of teaching. It focuses on his pedagogy. It focuses on the artifacts he produced with the students. It focuses on the way that these artifacts then became projects in the world, basically. He was a forefather to a lot of different concepts of environmentalism and structuralism. So the book really begins to break down how he collaborated with students, and it does so rather than chronologically, it does so through 4 different filters. The book has archives on his thinking on geometry, on his thinking of models, on his thinking of words and language, and then finally on his thinking of patterns, arguing that actually all of these lines of thinking are operating in parallel. So rather than a chronology from this date to that date, we break down his work, or I break down his work into these lines of thinking, and working along with my students, and we can talk about that a little bit later. We also have a whole archive of drawings now updated and ways to update it, the questions that he raised. Yeah, so.
Dr. Johnson.
Yes. Okay, so I also wanted to start by saying thank you to you, Dean Norton, and to Daniel as well for the conversations that we've had already about these books, and we're hoping to continue them in the future, maybe in something that we write or a class that we co-teach. So for my book, the easiest way, I guess, to succinctly summarize it is to just look at the title, meaning, evolution, and beauty. Those 3 topics sort of follow the structure of the book, starting with meaning. So I was hired here at USD to teach philosophy of language. You might not think a book like this is a philosophy of language book, but that's how I understand adornment and the meaning that we make with bodies. I sort of see language everywhere, not just in the words that we utter. Next, evolution. I ask, okay, so starting with bodies, we all put on clothes this morning, right? We all have shoes on, we all brushed our hair or didn't brush our hair. Those were decisions that we made. How did we want to present ourselves in the world when we went out today? And do animals do that as well? A lot of times when philosophers ask big questions like that, it requires breaking it up into parts. So we start with animal cases. With birds, hummingbirds are on the cover of my book. So they've evolved to have certain features that certainly are beautiful. Is that like what we did today when we got dressed? There are some animal behaviors that change the way that they look. So for instance, flamingos during mating season have a pink, waxy substance that's excreted that they spread on their feathers to make them more pink. So maybe animals adorn. And in the second half of the book, I look at Charles Darwin's distinction between natural selection and sexual selection to try to find parallels there. And then beauty, lastly. Can clothing be art? Can animals be art? And do animals perceive beauty in each other when they look at each other? What sort of force is beauty in shaping our bodies and shaping animal bodies?
Thank you. That gives you the foundation of what we're thinking about this morning. One thing I want to ask again before digging in is, God, I always want to know what inspires you? What inspired you to study what you study? What makes you wake up in the morning excited, or even to do this, or even as a child? Did it start as a child that it led you to this book? Basically, what inspired you?
So I started working on the archive of Buckminster Fuller because he was absolutely not covered in the canonical histories throughout my undergraduate, graduate. I knew nothing about his work, and it coincided with us starting an architecture program at the University of San Diego. So I came in and we launched our program in 2010, and I thought, what a remarkable archive to dive in, right? In ways, in kind of a model of shared inquiry where you would share with the students going in, and almost, I describe this as a kind of an archaeological dig. We start by looking at these artifacts and ways to kind of analyze and assemble it together. And then this led to a whole host of structuring our design studios, and then undergraduate research programs, and then more funded formal programs. So that's how I enter his work. I was fascinated, and to follow Marilynn on the title of the book, I was fascinated on this one concept that Bucky, he's informally referred to as Bucky, would put forth. He said that the world, or our environment, at the largest and smallest scales was like a pattern that is going out, full of entropy. Right? It's, imagine lines going out, and that our thinking, right? So pattern thinking, to go back to my title, patterns is our environment endlessly going out, and our thinking is the opposite. Our thinking is syntropic. It's trying desperately to zoom in and conceptualize and break our, what we see out in the world into concepts as a way to understand our relationship to our environment at every scale, from the microscopic to the macroscopic to the cosmic. So a combination of both of these things, both from a pedagogical level, how did he instrumentalize those relationships? How did he write, what's his pedagogical project for asking his students and our students? And then just at a personal level, this kind of questions that we still have today.
So what got you going on this?
Yeah, so going back to childhood, I guess, I have had an interest in clothing, fashion. I used to work at a vintage clothing store in college, for instance. And I also grew up in Minnesota in a family where everybody was very interested in birds. So those definitely are long-standing interests. But at the beginning of the book, I tell a story about during graduate school in New York City, I was working on my dissertation, which was on meaning, more focused on philosophy of language in particular. And I got a bird feeder that I stuck on the window in my New York City apartment, and the birds there are sort of desperate for food. So I had a lot of customers at my bird feeders. And I noticed that house finches, we have house finches here in California, I noticed the redder house finches would succeed in getting the first spot on the feeder. And then I noticed some of the duller house finches were waiting in the back. And so as I was thinking about meaning, I was watching this behavior and thinking, that redness definitely has meaning. The other males are learning the hierarchy based on who's the reddest. It turns out there are reasons behind that. Darwin also looked at birds in these same sorts of ways. So that's the question I sort of set aside and come to here in the book.
Great. You made me kind of excited. I hadn't heard this before when you told me that you are thinking of a team taught class. USD has lots of team taught classes where we like to think across disciplines. So here would be architecture and philosophy, which is phenomenal. And that kind of ties into what I asked you two to do. I asked them to come up with a couple of questions that might help you, the audience, see what the overarching theme is between their books. And one of the questions you came up with, and obviously started to design a class together over, was this question. In both of your works, you both explore the terrain of bodies. So can you tell us what bodies mean in the context of your works? And I'll open it up to either of you.
Okay, sure, I can go first this time. So again, let me refer to my title in answering this question. So my book just came out this year in 2022. In 2020, another book came out. We were writing at the same time by another philosopher named Stephen Davies called simply Adornment. And there's been a long-standing history in philosophy, other disciplines, of something called structuralism, where you try to find meaning in the object itself. This is seen in archaeology. Roland Barthes, who is popular in English departments, he wrote Death of the Author. He actually did some semiotics or structuralist research where he looked at French fashion magazines and tried to understand the meaning there in this structuralist sort of way. So with that sort of approach, you ignore the speaker, the wearer, the user of the artifact. You're looking at the thing itself or the words themselves. And in calling my book Adorning Bodies, I wanted to stress the ways that meaning changes based on the wearer. So, for instance, if I wear a black hoodie, that would mean something different if a teenage boy wears a black hoodie. I can wear these sparkly shoes if Daniel were wearing them. That would have a different meaning, right, in our cultural context. So I'm not just looking at meaning itself, but how is meaning changed based on the person who's wearing that artifact. And of course, thinking there of those physical bodies that we have.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much parallels in terms of, but when I think of bodies in the context of Buckminster Fuller, one of his most famous precepts or concepts was this idea of spaceship Earth. He coined this term spaceship Earth, meaning we are all together inside of this capsule. He wrote a book, a manual for Spaceship Earth, which is still his most successful manifesto. And I want to think about that notion of a single body and that we're all somehow interrelated. Right? That led to an enormous wave of thinking about environmental consciousness throughout the 50s and 60s. And we are still continuing to reflect on the questions that he raised. The other dimension of thinking about bodies, if you think of the Earth as one body, right, that we are all part of, the other dimension, when I was thinking about this question, is bodies of knowledge. So one of the things that Buckminster Fuller was constantly critical of was this idea of specialization, right? That disciplines fragment their bodies of knowledge into really specific and intricate languages, and then nobody can understand each other, right? And then in that interrelatedness is challenged. So he thought quite deliberately, and he invites us to think quite deliberately about what is the body of knowledge that we share, right, across disciplines. So when we're talking about the humanities or even co-taught courses, how are we able to overcome specialization to identify these larger questions and to tackle them together? So I think those are the two ways that I would come into this question.
So another way that your books tie together is that you both talk about patterns and decoration, and how patterns and decoration expand out into a cultural context. So can you explain what you both mean by that?
Sure, I can go first on this one as well. So yeah, I mentioned in the last one a little bit, so clothing has certain types of meaning. For instance, a black armband, that has meaning that we have to do a little bit of work to interpret, right? If I were wearing one in 1969, you might assume, oh, she's wearing that to protest the Vietnam War. And there's a famous Supreme Court case, Tinker v. Des Moines, where the Supreme Court ruled that that was protected as speech. But if I wore one today, what would I mean by that if I had one on right now? Maybe something about the war in Ukraine. If you knew me better, maybe you would be able to pick out what that was. But you would wonder, you would know there's meaning there. So context and culture shapes what things mean. That's also particular to gender, race, disability status, other body types like that as well. And that's certainly not the case throughout history either. So I have a picture in the book here of a prehistoric king in ancient Egypt who has a body that we would call an hourglass shape today. At that time in Egypt, they had an androgynous sun god. And so there, to represent power in the body of the king, they gave the king the body close to God, which for them was androgynous, which is different from how we would depict a powerful body in our culture today. So all of these things can change, right? And people work to change them. I talk in here, for instance, about a Million Hoodie March that took place 2012 after the killing of Trayvon Martin. And people do work to say, I can wear this. You need to change how you're interpreting it. And that's all culturally shaped, which also means that then there's the possibility for change of those meanings. Anything?
Yeah, absolutely. In architecture, as I explained to my students, there are so many received meanings to every pattern. So there isn't such a thing as starting from scratch, right? Every building, every act that we have on our built environment has both a received history, so you have to be in dialogue with thousands of years of what has come before you, and then a received perception by those that will occupy, and then a received set of rules and protocols. There isn't anything that's neutral. We were not instructed on how to occupy this room. We knew that there's a kind of a series of codes.
We didn't know what to do with this.
So that's exactly, we didn't know.
Yeah.
So to that end, there isn't a pattern without meaning. And every pattern has a political dimension, a cultural dimension, quite a physical dimension, right? Gothic architecture teaches you how it organizes itself. The Renaissance doesn't, right? The Renaissance plasters itself with all kinds of forms that are foreign to the structure of the project. But there is always a translation in between that dialogue, right? The present instance of the thing. And so in terms of Buckminster Fuller, obviously with geodesic domes, if you imagine all of this patterning, what is the meaning of that? What do these domes represent? Do they represent instances of the earth? Do they represent shelter? Do they represent interconnectedness? We know that a geodesic line is the most direct point on the surface of a sphere between 2 points. So there's an efficiency to it. We know he is in the 50s and 60s trying to standardize construction, right? So there's a regularity to these patterns. They have embedded meanings. Fuller, of course, also worked quite extensively on a project of cartography. So how do we translate this to maps? How do maps show us degrees and levels of inequality, right? These lines that are more efficient for some are inefficient for others, or leave others completely behind, right? So ways to kind of understand the layers implicit in patterns in the built environment.
As you're talking about patterns, structures, systems of all kinds, you're also talking about language and communication, and you've hinted on it. Can you talk more about the role of language and communication, in particular with architecture and adornment?
Do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So I have an entire chapter on words and on the way that Becky was inventive on words, and he even constructed words that didn't exist before. He would put words together and invent words. And in architecture, there's a long tradition dating back to the Renaissance and even before of writing dictionaries. So the idea here is rather than writing a specific discourse, the idea here is can we structure knowledge with terms with everything that we know? And then those that will come after can add to those definitions, can redact. And I just want to, I extracted a quote from Bucky, but he spent a substantial amount, decades, writing his own synergetics dictionary. It has over 50,000 entries and meticulously outlines in note cards that then become dictionary entries that then become synonyms and interrelated concepts. And he would describe words as, and I'm quoting, words are descriptions of mutually acknowledged experiences, so they're immediately collective. The dictionary is the ultimate collective concept, right? We understand the terms. The universe is the ultimate collective concept, and the universe, like the dictionary, is non-simultaneous. But non-simultaneous, considerable, and yet progressively revealing. So the chapter on his words, on the construction of words, was one that was fairly unknown in the scholarship around Bucky. We use architects, I say, draw and then write, right? We use language as a way to generatively design possibilities. Rather than a closing description, you use it as, can this be more patterned, or can it be less eccentric or concentric? So for us, as it was for Fuller, language is at the center of imagining new possibilities.
So in my book, I draw on a philosopher of language named Paul Grice, who draws a distinction between two different ways of meaning that we have in the world. He says that we get this with language, and I also argue that we have this with adornment. So one he calls natural meaning, and that's like the meaning that clouds have. He says clouds mean rain. How do they mean rain? It's not like how I mean I want coffee if I say coffee would keep me awake. It just has that meaning on its own, and somehow we interpret it Bodies also have meaning like that for us and for animals. We can look at someone's body and decide if they're a physical threat. We manipulate that sometimes. For instance, recently saw a picture of Trump going to testify in New York City. He very clearly wears elevator shoes. If you see his feet next time, look. His foot is like this in his shoe, right? So Trump manipulates the size of his physical body. Bears do that too. Bear fur will stand on end when they're in a fight, right? We do this all the time. High heels make you look taller. Costume designers, other people, we think about these things. We dye our hair, we put on self-tanner, right? So those are the cases where we're sort of like clouds. Our bodies are just taken to indicate certain things about us. And then, of course, there's the intentional dimension that something with clothing, with wearing a particular pin, wearing a particular rugby tie or something like that. There, we know that the person is choosing to convey this message to us. It's not just accidental, and we think about what's their intention. Like with the black armband, that's a case where you really have to know a lot about the person to figure out what are they protesting with this black armband.
So, in listening to both of you, the natural world is critical to both pieces of your work. But I just read an article a couple of weeks ago about how fashion, for example, is now becoming, artificial intelligence or machine learning is starting to design what people want. You walk into a certain store, your cell phone kind of knows where you're at. It records, where you stop. That's all collected, and then the fashion designer isn't being creative anymore. The fashion designer looks at the algorithm, learns what people want, and then we all start to look the same. In fact, I was just noticing everybody yesterday at an event I was at had this kind of pants, big pants, and they were yellow with the same material. And I just read that article. And you've been talking too, Daniel, about Buckminster Fuller tried to buck the trend of specialization, but he still liked patterns. I mean, how does your work, Adornment, Architecture of the Natural World, deal with this new machine learning world that we're entering? You didn't expect this question, sorry.
Well, I want to think about the way that Bucky encourages us to think about multiple layers, right? So inherent in systems thinking, you're thinking about the whole as much as you're thinking about specific layers. My reflection on the natural world had to do with geometry. So he's constantly drawing geometry, not as geometry, right? Lines are lines, clearly, but they're also lines of force. They also signify relationships. And he's constantly drawing drawings that look like models, and then models that look like drawings, and then domes that look like maps, maps that look like, and in this multiple layered system, he is constantly talking about non-simultaneity, right? That one is not able to comprehend the whole, but rather understand the layers of the parts and understand them as not affecting the whole directly, right? The whole isn't, the behavior of the whole is not a function of the addition of the parts. So going back to your question, how do we understand our cell phones, the patterns that they produce, quite literally, onto a larger whole? What is that larger whole? What does it mean to be tracked? What does it mean? I think now, curiously, we're all used to that. So we speak to our phones to get information from the ads that will come. We know, we preempt the way that, and if we do that too much, then the algorithm changes. How you make me think, your question makes me think, Noelle, how do we think about our interrelatedness without the pretension that we would understand the whole, right? And only at very immediate parts with these larger systems, right? And this goes to a social and even political dimension of how do we understand our groups that we communicate with intensively without knowing other groups, with knowing that they're separate from other groups, et cetera.
Yeah.
So that's what
it's complicated.
It makes me think about that.
Yeah, with respect to AI, So because my theories of meaning are so focused on intention, I think there's so much that we do with language, with clothing, that can never be captured or replicated by AI. I think we've all probably been quite frustrated by our Alexas at certain times, right? I've had mine. I was listening to some music, and I asked her what the song was called. She said something in French, and I wanted to be able to Google it. And I said, Alexa, how do you spell that? And she said, T-H-A-T. So we lose so much, with AI. And with clothing, there'll always be some human part that's not captured, by a computer, because all a computer can ever do is look at what we're already doing and feed it back to us, see what's worked in the past. And also, if we focus on things like social change, we need to be really skeptical of AI perpetuating what we've been doing if we want to go in a new direction.
Well, and you've just convinced the natural world is just at the heart of everything that you do. Yes. Language, meaning, structure, systems. I just could keep asking them questions, but I think it's your turn. So I don't know, do you want audience members to come up to one of the two microphones? Or sometimes we could hand them around if that's easier. Any questions? We'll see. You can, we're intimate enough, you can also just yell it out. Yeah, just yell it out.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Oh, interesting.
So it's a very controversial dimension of his work. Obviously, if one thinks about design as patented, then others can't use it, right? And it requires others to pay royalties, and it requires. So his official answer was that that patents are an objective way to get to the edge of knowledge. So through the patent office, if one is able to conceive of new things, the patent office becomes a portal by which you can actually ask those questions. And others might come and might do patent variations. Patents, of course, we know never start from scratch. Even in his patents, we traced all of his 28 patents onto timetables, and one of the joys was to discover that all of his patents were based on variations. You have to do patent citations. And to take one step back, he had an enormous conversation, which I cover on the chapter, which is that it animates that last chapter on his patent attorney, Robertson, right? So Robertson would tell him, you can't patent geometry, right? I mean, geometry is geometry, you can't patent it. So let's think about it as a building system, right? So how, as a building system, is this new? Right? So I think his interest and his absolute focus on patents was to ask that question. In what way is this new? In what way does it improve what has come before? All of his patents had citations, patent citations. They're based on, and quite a lot, right? So if you think of, it challenges the idea that a genius sits and from scratch draws something on a napkin and it comes from scratch. That's not true. His patents have citations. And then through tracing those citations, we discover that his patents today continue to be cited. So we discovered that actually the portal of intellectual property in his work continues. So we did a timeline of every year since his death, since 1983, how many patent variations continue today, and what kind of products are being patented that cite that original. And you have everything. And to me, that becomes one of the legacies of this work, that you have everything from choral building, geometries, musical instruments, things that are very, very far from the original stints and medical instruments. So during his life, he was very, very criticized. He did charge fees for domes per square foot. And he said that only through patenting his geometry, he was able to bend larger manufacturers of materials and not become consumed by them, right? So it was a kind of, it's a dichotomy, right? On the one hand, it has to do with control and authorship, and royalties and funding his research. He never had an office, he only worked with students. And on the other hand, it has to do with asking the question, what's the limit of knowledge, right? So that's...
I saw the woman in the front. Did you?
Oh, I just want to make a comment rather than a question, but I can make it a question. Are you aware of the one-man show that happened in San Diego?
Yes.
Yeah, because if today's students are unaware of Bucky, seeing a video maybe of that show would
Yes.
be...
Yes, and in fact, I'm in conversations with the screenwriter, and we are organizing that play was successful. It was a global, extraordinary show, and we are in conversations to bring it to campus. Oh no, I didn't know. I'm sorry. We know the author of the screenplay. So I'm in conversations with him.
Here's one here. Oh, and did I see your hand? And then on the other side, this direction. So 1, 2.
Hi, thank you for your talk. A question for Dr. Johnson. So I was wondering if you examined what in my mind are more complicated cases for this idea of adorning bodies in terms of in the natural world and in terms of evolution, I guess, because you talk about flamingos and I guess peacocks, those are easy cases. But I wonder spiders have these kind of things, or cockroaches, or really disgusting things. Do they have features that could be understood as adornment? And especially, and if so, that's my question.
Yeah, good question. Right, we get so focused on beauty and philosophy as a whole, right? Like going back to the ancient Greeks, there's this focus on beauty, but what about ugliness, right? So I do, and Darwin also was sort of bewitched by beauty. So I follow him in focusing on birds and butterflies and things like that. But there are other traits that are sexually selected for, like bird feathers, that to us look ugly. So there's this monkey called the proboscis, I think that's how you say it, proboscis monkey. It has this hideous, droopy nose to us, right? But that's sexually selected for. So the females prefer the males with this long, ugly to me, droopy nose, but to them, it looks, anyway, they choose to mate more with the males that have those, right? And that's why it's evolved to be that way. So it is important, and I talk about this in the last chapter on beauty. It is important to remember that when we're talking about sexual selection and these types of choices, it does skew the picture if you just think about birds. There are also other things that are sexually selected for, of course. Yeah, thank you.
And this man.
Yeah, my question is also for Dr. Johnson, and I'm actually, my own interest is quite a bit in the mind-body problem and personal identity, and it seems to me a major mistake Western philosophers at least have made is this disembodied self that isn't connected to the body. And I think there's a practical effect to this. I sometimes you get intellectual folks in particular that poo-poo things like fashion or appearance or dress. Very much like none of that matters. It's just this inner core self. But as you point out, very, very thoughtfully, it most certainly does matter. For example, if I go out with a hoodie as a kind of, academic-looking white man, nobody cares. But if a young African-American man wears a hoodie, there's going to be all kinds of horrible stereotypes. So it most definitely does matter. But it does seem like this sort of, I don't know if you want to call it a kind of intellectual snobbery or an eggheadism or some kind of atomism, but it does seem like there's this notion that the body doesn't matter and context doesn't matter. It's all this pure intellect. And it seems that you take that on, and I was hoping you might be able to elaborate a little bit on that if I've read it correctly.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, and of course, you're right. So we're at a Catholic institution right now. There's a lot of philosophical traditions going back that want the self not to be the body, because of course we know the body dies. And if we're that, then we die too. So there, in philosophy and other, and in religions as well, there is a focus on the self as consciousness, as this thing that can continue on past death. But unfortunately, a lot of the time, right, we have these bodies that sometimes have pain, are inconvenient in certain ways. And yeah, I definitely have gotten pushback from other philosophers presenting this work. There's the philosopher I mentioned he wrote the book Adornment. We had an exchange in a journal called the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, and I was pushing him about bodies and saying that, women, people of color, are more forced to acknowledge the reality of their body than other people are, who it's easier to ignore. And he said that for him, he'd rather be judged by the books in his bookshelf than the tasteless attire that he wears. And I said, what a luxury that would be, right? As somebody who got sent to the principal's office for wearing a spaghetti-strap tank top in high school, I know my body at a certain point in my life was seen as a threat, right? And a lot of other people have had experiences like that, right? So we can't ignore this, this thing we all have that's sitting in a chair right now. That is, in some sense, part of us. How is our gender, our race perceived by others? Those are separate questions that, as I've mentioned, hopefully are the sort of things that can be changed. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. I see a guy with the sunglasses. His name's Dr. Mike Kelly.
Oh, yeah.
Philosopher.
Thank you both. It's really interesting. The question is for both of you. I hope it's clear. I have a puppy that's been up all night because it ate my carpet. So in listening to both of the presentations, as we kind of move through, I guess, what we might call the interpretive process of gathering the meaning of a particular physical architectural structure or adorning aesthetic structure on a body, that we find that there's a certain kind of meaningfulness or purpose behind various presentations or constructions. And insofar as we look at them, the purpose generally tends to kind of be instrumental. We're trying to present a view, kind of an image, a constructed space. And so I'm just wondering if in your books, either one of you talk about the meaningfulness of the useless or that which is not instrumental, kind of pure adornment, the superfluous, that kind of thing. I'm just wondering if there's a space for something like the useless or the meaningfulness in the useless.
I guess, I don't know what useless clothing is. And certainly with the evolution cases, I mean, there's junk DNA, there's stuff like that. But evolution doesn't really trade on uselessness. So, the peacock's tail is there because it does something. Does it help it fly? Certainly not. Does it help it avoid predators? Certainly not. So it must be doing something else. And similarly, everything we put on today, we put on for a reason. That was a conscious, intentional action. And I think we're actually quite discerning in the sorts of things we choose to put on our bodies. It's funny, I mentioned some of the pushback that I've gotten when I've presented this. Of course, philosophers love to just be sloppy as possible, right? I presented this at a conference in Australia with a famous philosopher who never wears shoes, right? And that's his thing. We went to a restaurant and he wasn't wearing shoes. But he does that for a reason. He can get away with that for a reason. I don't think there is a space for uselessness in my work. I'd be curious to hear what you think that might be in clothing. I actually don't think it's there.
I think, just to clip it, that's a great question because it challenges and all these discourses about efficiency in architecture. You make me think, Mike, about intricacy. Right? So Fuller was incredibly committed to making intricate and more intricate and ever more intricate structures that in their intricacy were absolutely, that their intricacy was absolutely unnecessary. We've continued in architecture to continue to do this. We can make things incredibly intricate for no reason whatsoever because we have the means by which we can, add more and more intricacy or information. And at the same time, they're mesmerizing. Right? So he would explain to you exactly why these things were absolutely rational in their absolute irrationality structurally. And one of the exciting discoveries of the book is that I convinced some of my mentors and kind of world-established engineers to really calculate these structures, to take him at his word, and they are absolutely inefficient in so many different ways. We do not build regular structures anymore because we know structure distributes itself irregularly. So, in that sense, the degree to which we define useless or uselessness, mesmerizing forms, and pattern fascination, pattern recognition, even if that pattern is absolutely incomprehensible or redundant, or it's at the heart of your question. Thank you for that.
I have one, I know we're at 11:16. It's going to be a super short question. Your answer will be short as well. Daniel has been invited twice to take our students and his work to the Venice Biennial. Yeah. And you need a philosopher now to join the team. I think
Am I being invited to Venice?
Yeah, but when you team teach this class, or when you take the students to Venice again, what will be the title of your work or your class?
Maybe Form and Function.
Yeah, I think something along those lines. We spend quite a lot of time with the students, both in the seminars and in the design studios, thinking about the function of form, right? It's such an obvious question, but what function, what's the dimension of that? Ornament and adornment is at the center of that, right? What's the function of adorning ourselves in particular, or buildings adorning themselves in a particular historical style or in a particular material style, right? I mean,
maybe beauty and form and function. I think that's better.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're a little bit, thank you. We're signing you right up.